Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. These days, it's rarely a case of if you'll be hacked and more of a question of when. Once the attacker has passed your defenses, they cover their tracks and systematically infiltrate your network to steal information or shut your business down. You need to rethink the way security is delivered for your digitally transformed business, and there's one security solution that delivers it all: NetScout. Get visibility without borders for consistent detection, mitigation, and prevention across any network, data center, cloud, 5G, and more. Learn more at securityweekly.com/NetScout. Welcome everyone. We are here at Black Hat. It's 2019. I'm so excited. This is our first interview of Black Hat this year, and it's a little different. We're not at the pool area like we were last year, but we've got a lot of great interviews, and I'm excited to introduce Hardik Modi. He's the Senior Director of Threat Intelligence for NetScout. Hardik, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Paul. Good to be here.
Yes, nice to have you here. And we've got a lot of really cool and fun things to talk about. NetScout's done a threat intelligence report.
That's right.
And a lot of people do threat intelligence reports. However, when I read through the notes on it, I was intrigued by several topics. So the first of which was when you looked at the data, I'm assuming you're collecting from your various networks that NetScout owns and maintains, is the basically malware on smartphones. And I think a lot of times we talk about this from a personal perspective, like someone's breaking into my smartphone to get at my data.
Yeah.
But I've always been very concerned about someone getting into a lot of different people's smartphones, not caring what's on the phone, but using it either as a jumping off point or to do a denial of service attack. And you have some evidence that that happened.
We do. And so, yes, our findings are from the first half of this year. So, like, let's say January through late June 2019. And in that period, I can point to two specific examples of, the use of mobile devices in attacks. So, and people tend to forget, like, mobile devices are just another form of IoT. So when we say IoT is a security risk, absolutely mobile devices are right in there. So I'll start with an APT group that we're tracking. So these are actually some guys that we named a few years ago, like the Donut team, that we attribute to be an Indian APT. And absolutely, they've, where they still do their phishing campaigns and they still, run, they weaponized like spreadsheets and other forms of like MS Office documents. We have seen in the first 6 months of the year transition to APK, like Android malware.
Well, because Android packages are really easy to Trojan, right? I mean, I've seen research from years ago where pen testers are like, basically you can just like put extra code inside of an Android package and you're off to the races, right?
And again, the app stores are just like, there's just so many. They're not controlled. Like, maybe, a few of them have some kind of bounds around them. But like
Google's gotten a little better, but it's still, I believe, easy to Trojan an Android package.
So that was the first. And then number two, there's like this thing called a constrained like application protocol. So it's basically this really, really lightweight protocol that was meant to have other security features built on top of it. But as we know, like devices get built and like they need to go to market like as soon as possible.
Right.
And some of them get shipped out with with just the basic protocol. So what
there's an internal communication protocol on the phones, right? That allows apps to talk. It's kind of like IPC was, inter-process communication was before, but it's on the phone, right?
No. So CoAP is more of a network, a full network kind of control protocol, like for these devices. So a whole bunch of devices got shipped with CoAP on them, like completely insecure. And then somebody went ahead and found that it's really easy to do reflection amplification DDoS attacks using these devices.
And is that specific to Android?
So those are. I think the protocol can be deployed independent of the underlying OS, but is the best we know, like
it's mostly Android.
A whole bunch of devices are out there that have those now.
And Android represents still the largest market share globally, right?
Absolutely.
In the U.S., there's more concentration of, but you mentioned India before. I think outside the U.S., Android is probably more popular.
And the DDoS attacks that we saw largely involved devices in China.
Yep.
So yes, incredibly popular Android, in the marketplace there. And yeah, these devices were being used for DDoS attacks. We saw a whole bunch of attacks. We realized that there was a really, kind of significant amplification factor. So as in you could send a fairly small packet and get a big one back.
Right.
And
that's a recipe for
yes. But now the good news was that these had, fairly dynamic IP addresses. So as soon as the adversary found okay, I have a botnet of 300,000 that I could use to launch the attack.
You're going to lose.
A week later, a whole bunch of them have shifted. Now,
I'm sure they're going to work around that problem eventually.
That's coming next. But that's that's like mobile devices, in the security world right now.
Right. You also said in the report that it's little as 5 days from a new attack vector being discovered to weaponization. And we've tracked this in years past as vulnerability versus release of the exploit, right? But in this case, you didn't use the words vulnerability and exploit, right? It's an attack vector that can be weaponized. So this doesn't mean people should patch quicker, because that probably isn't going to help you today as much as it used to.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd still say that for your average, if Microsoft does Patch Tuesday, please patch.
Sure. The major ones, I agree.
Yeah. Now, in this case, again, in the in the DDoS scenario, if you are the target, it's not about whether you patched or didn't patch.
It's
matter. About everybody else who's being used to attack you. So that's and actually in DDoS, weaponization is really interesting because it isn't just hey, I'm a smart person and I have decided to use this vulnerability that I saw somebody talk about at a conference. This is actual use of it on online platforms. So what we call the booter stressor services, where I can just go to a website and I can say I want to launch an attack and I'll pay you $5 or Bitcoin to equivalent to launch an attack against.
And you give them a target.
Yeah.
And
now you don't really know what they're using. But those guys are innovating all the time. They have all the incentive in the world to innovate.
And that's their business.
That's their business. So they're paying attention to these vulnerabilities that are being announced.
Because they can have a better service.
Yeah, and that gets incorporated into their service and then used
there's a whole bunch of shady stuff that goes on. There's a whole other interview we could do about the shady stuff.
I know,
But one of the use cases you pointed out in the report was that students could use this to launch a denial of service attack against a testing site. Because a lot of the testing that happens in colleges, university, I would imagine even high school today happens online. So if you didn't prepare for the test, but you have $5 to go buy a denial of service attack, you can do that, which is now the equivalent of pulling the fire alarm before the test happens, right?
The modern day equivalent. Yeah, no, so you're right. And so in this case, we had a university basically come to us and say, hey guys, fine, we have products, we have all this stuff, but this just keeps happening. And so they signed up for our service, and that's it. They would talk to us about how when it's time for testing, that's exactly when they would see those attacks. Now,
interesting. So they were actually, this is a practical thing. This isn't just something you observed. You had a customer that was experiencing this.
We had somebody who came to us and said, yes, signed up for the service specifically for that reason.
That's awesome.
And again, with DDoS, it is. I'll just caveat, lay it out there. There's enough the techniques involved don't always lend themselves towards solid attribution. You can't always go So I agree. Do we know who that person is? Who launched these attacks and why? Specifically, but you can draw inferences from every time you do a test, if that's exactly when you're going to start getting your DDoS attack, clearly,
also if it follows that same student around, you know what I mean? You could do some analysis on students who are registered, right? You know what I mean?
That's another podcast right there.
Exactly. It is. That's an interesting investigation for sure. Yeah. And I think, coaching our students on morals and ethics and values is really there's true fix there.
The right way out. Yeah.
Some of the other things that we want to talk about were in the IoT space, right? And I made this parallel to when in the early 2000s, if you had a large network, university or otherwise, right, and you were to build a Windows system in 2002, 2003, while you were building it, it was compromised by worms. So we had to create these safe zones inside of our network to actually build the systems because there was so many vulnerabilities that were remotely exploitable. Now, largely in the Windows front, that changed. Linux front, that changed as well. But now with IoT, your report indicates that now we're starting this cycle all over again, that if you put an IoT device on the internet, with a default username and password, it's compromised right away.
And Paul, think about it. I mean, is any of us building IoT devices? No.
We're just sticking them on the network.
We're just deploying them, and so some other this is independent research that we've cited, like upwards of 7 million IoT devices being deployed every day. That's not sitting in a lab with somebody's kind of updating software before it goes live. It's just going out there. A whole bunch of this stuff sits on a shelf in a store.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, from the time it's built and like it OEM'd and somebody puts software on it to where, maybe in Best Buy you walk up and buy yourself the camera. That's we're talking months.
Right.
How many vulnerabilities would have been discovered even in that time? So even if it was secure when it shipped, secure at deployment isn't a reality. And now there are other ways in which people are mitigating this. True. Yep. However, there's clear. We see this. A lot that there are plenty of vulnerable IoT devices on the internet, and they're being exploited, in so many different ways.
Many of them don't auto-update either.
Many of them don't auto-update.
And is that a cost thing now that I think about it? Because if you think about building the infrastructure and the software to support, hey, this thing just auto-updates and never has an issue, there's a lot of resources that go into that. Yeah. So I think they're shelving that so they can get stuff out faster and cheaper.
I think, you put yourself in their shoes, certainly time to market is always a thing.
Right.
From the standpoint of the deployment, right? I mean, we see this, how many times do we yell at Microsoft for Patch Tuesday going wrong? If you were to find that, hey, all of your cameras across the whole city just went kaput because there was a bad software update. So we're not there in terms of confidence in these systems. I do think that that's necessary. It's not like there will be other mitigations that are used, but there's no doubt that you cannot be deploying software and just letting it sit.
Yeah.
And
it's tricky on IoT devices too, as you know, because the operating system, file system, applications are all kind of in the same file, essentially. If that goes wrong, everything stops. Whereas a Windows or Linux system, you can apply an update to a package or something, you can back it out, the system's still running. In IoT, it just goes away.
Yeah,
you said, the cameras just go away.
Yeah, and with desktop computing and servers, we're what are we talking? 30 years, 40 years of experience doing this.
Right, correct.
So many things that went wrong along the way. But this is different. And then absolutely, there's just let's say you're in an operating theater. You're having surgery done on yourself, and the machines around you suddenly decide that it's time to update. Let me let's take a break here. It doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah,
so
it's true. Now the FTC has imposed fines on certain manufacturers. Specifically, you mentioned D-Link in here, but there have been select others, and that's a very hot. And again, another show in and of itself is that debate between regulation and not regulation in the space of IoT, where if D-Link, for example, puts out something that's vulnerable, they could incur fines from the FTC, and that's certainly happened. Do you think that's helping? Do we need more of that?
I have no doubt. Yes, it is happening, and we need more of it. And I think especially for the larger, more reputable vendors. I mean, this is one way in which they're held accountable.
Right.
And there are costs to society that we are incurring as a society as a result of the devices being the way they are. In some cases, and I can't speak to exactly who was negligent, but there have been some instances of that, vulnerabilities that are well known, well understood, well publicized, that the vendor has decided, tough luck, we're just going to leave the device exactly the way it is. And we as consumers can certainly agitate for better practices, but the government represents us, and that's part of their job. So
there's a lot of parallels there, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And when you buy a vehicle, the manufacturer will recall it to fix things. Largely, that doesn't happen in many of the scenarios. If a vulnerable router gets out there, D-Link or whoever the vendor is, isn't recalling it to fix it, right?
Yeah. And you really think about it, gets really interesting because the vehicle pretty soon is just a collection of IoT devices.
Yeah, exactly.
On a little network inside with some hardware around it.
Right.
But we're gonna see. Just in the auto industry, it's gonna be interesting to see how they respond. And you and I are seeing that right now.
Right.
Their responses. DEF CON is gonna have a lot of focus on the auto security in automobiles. But yeah, we still have some ways to
I think
go.
regulation's going to help. Whether it truly solves the problem, I think will remain to be seen. But I think it can help push the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, I do think it's one leg of that stool that needs to happen, and plenty of other work has to happen, including from people in the industry, like on just thinking this through and building better IoT devices and computing systems.
Now, you have a couple of resources for our listeners. These will be in the show notes as well for this interview. But you've got the threat report, and you've got another free service as well.
Yes, absolutely. So we published this report yesterday, maybe it was the day before, and is available, yes, for free. I do want to emphasize, we don't capture your creds. You don't have to give your creds or anything to have access to this document. So please go to the website, download it.
There's no registration?
No registration. Okay. No registration required. Beautiful. You can register to keep in touch with us.
Right.
But
you don't have to.
We've decided that we're going to leave the report out there for people to consume.
And that's netscout.com/threat report.
That's it. And then so we publish these every 6 months, a kind of a collection based on our collections and, deeper analysis of what we're seeing. But what we've done is launched a situational awareness platform. That's how we think of it, that we're calling Cyber Threat Horizon. That's more a real-time view of our collections. So here's attacks happening right now. Yeah, there are pew-pew maps in there, but they're, with a lot of capability to let you go, okay, what's happening to myself, like people like myself, or people that I care about. And so you could be like, hey, I care about manufacturing in Southeast Asia, and then you go like, okay, here's the attacks that are happening there, and also like couple that with summary reports and other ways in which we represent what we're seeing in the landscape. And I do want to point out, like we have worldwide visibility into attacks. We talk about...
You talked about India and Pakistan, right, being in the report, and some intelligence coming from the cyber attacks that are happening.
But and in the DDoS, just in DDoS, say we can report on 4 million DDoS attacks just from the first 6 months of the year.
Wow.
So that's kind of the breadth of which we see events across the internet, and that's now represented in Cyber Threat Horizon. So that's at horizon.netscout.com. We're basically announcing it this week. And
Sweet.
Yeah, it's a free resource. Have at it.
Awesome. Hardik, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
Welcome to Security Weekly. My name is Matt Alderman. I'm your host, and we are recording live from Black Hat 2019. We're in our suite at Mandalay Bay, and joining me for this interview is Paul Landsey, Chief Operating Officer at Remediant. Paul, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to finally connect. I've known some of your folks for a little while in Colorado, so it's always great to kind of bring the executives together when we get into a conversation of people that I know. So it's always good to kind of tie those dots together.
Absolutely.
So let's talk privileged access, because it's an interesting topic for me. And the reason is I only think...
For me too, as it turns out.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. I'm a believer that there's only 3 types of controls that transcend digital transformation: identity user, application, and data security. Because we're abstracting away so many other layers as we move to cloud and we do these other things. And so identities always interest me. Privileged access is a very interesting challenge. So let's start with some of the challenges around privileged access and then start talking about how does Remediant solve this?
Yeah, I love that you put identity first in your list of core controls, because so much of what we talk about today with Beyond Core and the new models and the new way of thinking about security, identity becomes the thing that matters the most, right? So before we used to think about how do we protect operating systems and how do we protect networks. Now it's about how do we protect the identities of these users. And really, when we think about privileged access unfortunately gives the ability for those that hold it to get past a lot of the other security controls. And so when we think about how do we protect these privileged accounts, the core thing is about how do we limit the amount of privileged access that they have to just the minimal set that they need for just the time that they need it. And then that's going to allow us to then provide that protection to those other layers you mentioned as well.
So instead of giving root access to someone on a permanent kind of basis, really what you're talking about is if you need escalated privileges, you can have only those escalated privileges that you need only for the time that you need it, instead of having this root or admin-based account available all the time.
That's right. And even better, on just the system or systems that you need it on. So when we think about the domains in which we limit that privilege access, so historically, like you said, we just grant root account access to whoever needed it, right? Whoever needed it on whatever basis we felt like they needed it for, which usually resulted in lots of admins having lots of admin rights on every system in the ecosystem, right? Every computer out there. And so if that account ever was compromised, game over, right? And when you look at the attack chain, the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain specifically, there's a step there where an attacker pivots from having a non-privileged account to then compromising the credentials for a privileged account. And it's very difficult to stop them.
And then they have full keys to the kingdom, right? They can move pretty much anywhere in the environment. So how do you do this? Because I know other privileged access management solutions, because they've been on the market for a long time. You guys are newer to the market. And a lot of people would require the admin to log into a vault with credentials to grab a password for a specific account and use it. Seems a little cumbersome to me, right? If you think about what you have to do to get access to these different accounts and devices. How do you guys do it, right? Where's that secret sauce? Because I'm curious how you make this time-based, limit-based solution work.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we looked at that attack chain, we really felt like that was the step where we can make a difference, right? And that password vaults today, they solve about 10% of the problem. And historically, they've been the way that PAM has been solved. I mean, people have historically equivalent for PAM equals password vault. But we really felt like there was a shift that was needed in the mindset and away from the idea that authentication could be the protection, and instead think about access rights being the protection around that privilege access. So historically, people have built better password vaults, more security, more deeper encryption, faster rotation of the credentials. But ultimately that hits a maximum, and then there's still a lot of unsolved problems out there. And so the way that we think about this is, rather than thinking about the authentication as a protection, remove the access that is unnecessary. So even if the account is compromised, even if I steal your raw credentials and I can log in, I find that actually that account doesn't have any privilege access.
Oh, okay.
And that's really the key difference, is moving away from a model of thinking about authentication as a protection to thinking about access as a protection.
Okay.
Now, it turns out there's some other benefits of this approach. As we look toward enterprises are starting to move away from passwords, right? Or moving away from having passwords that rotate really frequently, all of a sudden password vaults become problematic, because if I don't actually authenticate to my computer using a password, if I do it with just a biometric or a smart card, I can't rotate that credential. And so that approach, that password vaulting approach, doesn't really work anymore. Whereas our approach, where the access rights are the thing that's dynamic, continues to work no matter what the authentication mechanism
So
is.
in that particular case, then, the user has a minimum set of access rights, and basically they request to get higher level access rights for a period of time. Is that really how it works?
Exactly. So the first step for them is to log into our web interface. Now, the key part there is they're logging into our web interface using two-factor authentication.
Okay.
So all those requirements, PCI requirements, 800.171 requirements that require you to have multi-factor authentication around privilege access, just got satisfied, because you now have users that are authenticated using two-factor authentication. Now, once they're into Secure One, then they can type the name of the system or systems that they want to get privilege access to, and assuming that they're on the list of users authorized to get that just-in-time access, we would then immediately grant them those rights. Now, it's for the time-limited period. So by default, it's 4 hours, could be more or less.
Okay.
And so their account is then given those rights for just that time. And then the really cool part is then they can log into that system using whatever they want. They could SSH in, they could run remote PowerShell, they could hit the admin endpoint. It doesn't really matter to us at that point, because we know that their admin rights are limited to just that system or systems that they need those rights on for just that period of time. They can use whatever tool they have in their tool chain to affect their admin activity.
And that's great for remote management, right? Because you don't need access to that machine the entire time.
Right.
So by giving them a portal to log into, and if you're authorized to have those access rights, it gives them to them. And then you said it's configurable. So I assume you could lock it down to an hour or whatever that duration is, just to really help kind of reduce that attack surface.
That's right. And so when enterprises deploy our software, we usually see between an 85 and 95% reduction in the persistent admin rights. So think about users. If you take the number of users and the number of admin rights they have on a number of systems, it's usually in the millions for even a relatively small enterprise. And we can get that number down to persistent rights down to, in the low thousands, or maybe even zero if the enterprise really wants to take the just-in-time model all the way to the maximum.
Wow. So let me throw a curveball at you for a second, because I've worked for 2 vulnerability management companies, Qualys and Tenable. And one of the issues was always about how to get privileged access to do your scans, for example. Now, granted, in the case of agents, they've kind of bypassed that, but that's still an age-old problem. Could you solve that challenge from Secure One where you could provide the scanners temporary rights to do a privileged scan to get the information?
Yeah, in fact, we have customers doing exactly that today.
Okay.
So because our platform is built from the API up, we interact with users via our web UI just the same way we interact with applications via our application API.
Okay.
And so whether it's a vulnerability scanner that needs temporary privilege rights or some in-house software distribution mechanism or something else that needs admin rights, as long as it's authorized, we can issue an API key to that application. They authenticate to us using that API key. There's some other magic that's involved to making sure that the call is coming from the right place. They request access, again, as long as that particular application account is authorized to get access rights on that system or systems. We grant those rights usually within about 15 milliseconds. So we've granted the rights by the time that scanner or whatever it is wants to connect to that system.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And obviously doing it at scale has to be there because, you're potentially scanning thousands of devices
Hundreds
or tens
of
of
thousands.
depending on which network segment, et cetera, that you're
That's right.
doing. But that's a really clean way to provide a service-based account for the scanners and give them access for a time-limited period to do the scans and then shut them down. So even if those credentials were compromised for some reason,
Somehow.
we won't get into all the things we used to have to do to protect those credentials back in the day, but it would. Yeah, it still minimizes the attack surface and still allows the scanner to do what it needs to do.
That's right. The other thing that we partner this with is some continuous monitoring technology. Now, continuous monitoring is used in other parts of the information ecosystem and has been for a long time, but people haven't really thought to apply it in the PAM space historically. Access rights were granted via the password vault, and it was just sort of assumed that whatever rights were out there were already in the vault. Now, the vault can only protect the things that are in the vault. So one of the common attack patterns we saw was an attacker would somehow compromise an account and then set up local accounts with privileged access. Now, those local accounts weren't in the password vault. Password vault didn't know about them, couldn't protect them. And so then the attacker would use those local accounts to then continue to move laterally or do damage. And so with our approach, we scan not only provide the just-in-time access, but we also scan looking for any rights that don't match what we think they should be on that system.
Oh, got it.
And if we ever detect a discrepancy there, we immediately correct that discrepancy and also send an alert to the SIM to say,
you can identify local admin accounts
exactly
on those systems that shouldn't be there.
That's right.
Then do you allow those to be locked down or cleaned up? How do you handle that part of the remediation side of it?
That's right. It's all configurable. So most customers at that point would just have the privilege access stripped away from that local account. The local account would continue to exist for whatever purpose it's supposed to have, but the admin rights would be stripped away.
Got it.
So that the risk level would be lowered for that local account.
Yeah, and then now you would know about it. So now if somebody needed higher access rights to that local account, you would now be able to manage them as part of Secure One.
That's right.
Which is good.
Exactly.
That's great.
And you mentioned scanning this at scale. So one of our largest public reference customers today is Lockheed Martin. And so we're really happy to have them as a customer. Now that's about 150,000 systems spread globally.
Yeah.
And so we're able to scan their environment quite quickly and give them real-time insights into the changes in privilege access across their ecosystem, authorized or otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big challenges is people don't know what rights are out there.
That's right.
Right? You assume they're all controlled through Active Directory or through some other source, but who knows what else has been done to those local devices, local machines, what else is out there that's not in Active Directory potentially, right? So there is a pretty big gap, I think, in understanding where are all my accounts and what rights do they have and are they appropriate or not.
That's right. So we do half-day POCs with customers, and we do that for two reasons. One is to give them some insights, just like you were describing, to give them some view into what accounts and where those accounts have access. But the second thing is because as a startup, we want to make sure that the companies that we want to work with have a compatible set of problems and a compatible ecosystem with the approach that we take. But we've yet to do one of these POCs where we haven't shown the data and they said, "Oh my gosh, look at this crazy data!
Right.
I had no idea these accounts had privileged access on tens of thousands of systems all the time." And you mentioned the local accounts; that's a really key thing. So a lot of security teams assume that all the privileged access they have is managed by AD group memberships, right? And maybe they have some IGA solution or something that's helping them out with that. But these local accounts, Active Directory doesn't know anything about them. By definition, they're local to that machine.
Right.
They're not part of the directory.
Right.
And that's really where one of the big discoveries that we have with our customers lies, is in finding out that these local accounts have privileged access.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, and like you said, if they're not in the vault, nobody knows they're there.
That's
they're
right.
not managed by the vaults, and it's an attack vector, right?
That's it,
That
yeah.
has to be locked down.
Exactly. It's in your blind spot.
So if we think about some value, right? I mean, obviously, if you're doing a half-day POC, you're providing value in a very short time window. Is that, I mean, it's got to be an ease of deployment, kind of really show the data, and once you see it, you kind of get it. Is that kind of your approach from a go-to-market perspective?
Yeah, often the customers, when we go and do the half-day POCs, they know they have a problem, right? Because one of the things that is great about AD Group is you can deeply nest them. But one of the challenges of AD Groups is you could deeply nest them. And so they might know that at the top level, this AD Group confers some privileged access somewhere, but they have no idea what the full net membership of that group is, because it has all these crazy nesting. So really, just within, like I said, within a half day, we can sort of flatten all that all out for them, give them a viewpoint into exactly what groups are providing privileged access on what systems. Yeah, it's a really fast
Visibility.
time to play. Visibility is huge.
First key, right? Without visibility, it's hard to do anything else, right? So that's something you can do very quickly. And then I imagine once you have that visibility, and once you start to then put the right protections in place, it now gives you better control over the identity access rights across the organization.
That's right.
And having that control is something that I think is still challenging for a lot of organizations.
It is challenging for a lot of organizations. It was challenging 10 years ago. It's even more challenging when we look at things like DevOps, where admin rights need to be granted and removed on a just-in-time basis, because you've now taken your developer team, which really probably shouldn't have production system access 24/7.
But they do.
But they do. And your operations team, which probably does need that access,
Right.
and you've mushed them together, right? And there's a lot of philosophical thinking about
Right.
how does that work? But the net of that from an admin rights perspective is that those people will need to get admin rights sometimes to deal with support issues,
Right.
but you don't want them to have admin rights all the time. And
Yeah.
so, all the problems of 10 years ago have simply been compounded by this move toward DevOps. But that's one of the things where Remediant really is.
And I think
starting
more
to solve.
accounts, right? You think
Yep,
about
more
all the
accounts,
service
absolutely.
accounts, think about all the APIs, think about all the other places you're authenticating across these very distributed applications. That's only going to explode the number of accounts across these environments. At least you hope so, because otherwise, if you're using one account across all these environments, now you just reintroduce the crazy attack surface scenario that a few have fallen victim to. But if you do it right, then each of those communications have their own service accounts that are authenticating across all these different places, which is going to explode the number of accounts that need to be managed. And
That's
that
right.
will be the challenge at scale.
Yeah, one of the things we've seen, again, historically, the last 10 years or so, guidance from Microsoft, et cetera, has been that for admins, you might want to have them have multiple accounts. Like one human,
Right.
Matt has the
Yeah.
ADM.
I have my
account.
regular account, and then I have my admin account.
Right. And some enterprises have taken this to the extreme where they have maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 accounts per person to have different privilege access in different domains or in different sets of the network. And this just becomes a management nightmare.
Right.
I mean, not only for the user, the poor admin who actually has to try and remember passwords for 8 different accounts, but also from an IGA's perspective, IAM's, identity being the core of the, like you said, of the controls. Now this person's got 8 different identities. That makes it just a nightmare to manage. And so one of the things we've seen customers be able to do is actually pull back from that. And so individuals only have a single account because those admin rights are granted on a just-in-time basis.
And now, based on what they need to have access to, you can have different levels of access rights to those 8 different things, still one account, but then allow them to manage those different access rights on a just-in-time basis more efficiently. So you actually simplify part of the challenge.
That's right. And it reinforces this core identity message where one human equals one account.
Right.
And there may be a million bot accounts out there or RPA accounts or automation accounts or whatever, but we can at least get closer to having one account per human because that makes so much of the rest of the security ecosystem easier to manage.
Yeah, it helps that unification of the identity, which is still a challenge in our space. But
Yeah. And that sort of identity-centric thinking, I think, is the next 10 years, right? Is going to be based on this idea that the identity is the new firewall.
Yeah, it is. It's the new perimeter. I mean, I always used to say it was the identity and the application are the new perimeter. And I've had people challenge me and say, no, it's really the identity. Now, I say identity application because the way I think about it is most people are authenticating to an app to do something, or my smartphone app is authenticating me to do something, right? So I always think about the combination, but if you really think about it, it is the identity itself is really the new perimeter because users are anywhere and everywhere now.
That's true. Absolutely true.
So if people want to get more information about Remediant, where should they go?
Yeah, our best bet is our website, or remediant.com. We actually have a brand new white paper up there that talks about just-in-time access. So would welcome feedback on that one and viewers to check that out.
That's awesome. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. And with that, we'll end this interview and we'll see you again soon.
Welcome, everyone. We're here at Black Hat in 2019. That's right. We're recording a whole series of interviews. Excited about this one with Gavin Hill. He's the VP of Data Center Network Security Products at BitDefender. Gavin, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you here. So you want to talk about speculative execution. I guess for our audience, maybe like a little refresher as to what that is and how some of the newer exploits work.
Sure. So speculative execution is actually something included in modern CPUs, pretty much from like 2012 timeframe. And it's purely from a performance perspective, where CPUs are designed to try and predict what the outcome of an instruction is. And based on that prediction of the outcome, they can obviously perform a lot faster from a performance perspective.
You know, it's amazing. When we started talking about these attacks, I remember branch prediction being drawn on a chalkboard by my computer science teacher in college.
Yeah.
And now I see vulnerabilities, and I was like, wow, if I could have known what these vulnerabilities were, I might have been able to find it back then.
Yeah.
So, but it's largely for performance, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And so how have some of the attacks used this feature in order to gain exploitation?
Well, one of the ways, especially like what our researchers have found, is you can almost via brute force, not predict, but instruct the CPU with false information as to what it's speculating what the outcome will be, and as a result capture user and kernel space memory.
Gotcha. Now you're releasing a new report based on some other things that you found. Largely what we've talked about has already been publicized.
Yeah,
correct?
so we have. So what we're releasing is, we actually released it yesterday. It's a new vulnerability that our researchers have found related to swap.gs. And it's something that they've been working with, and they disclosed via fair and public disclosure way back in August of last year with the community, and they've been working with the likes of Intel and Microsoft so that it's all obviously patched before anything is released, and that's why everything was on embargo until as of yesterday. What it is it allows an attacker really to take advantage of the speculative execution in Intel CPUs, and as a result capture specific user and kernel memory space.
Gotcha. And it's a variation on some of those speculative execution attacks.
It is a variation of Spectre. So any Spectre or Meltdown mitigations, it bypasses.
Interesting.
By simply brute forcing or using the swap.gs, one of the gadgets.
Oh, so swap.gs is a component in the instruction set?
It is.
Gotcha.
Yes. Yeah.
That's really cool. So it took a year. What was going on for that whole year? Obviously, this is not an easy vulnerability to just fix, right?
It is not. So there are a couple of mitigations. One is obviously looking at the KPTI and how do you separate the user and kernel memory space and make sure. And the other is obviously how do you serialize the speculative execution so that you can then mitigate the actual vulnerability. That is what Microsoft have been looking at, and that's one of the patches that Microsoft have issued as of last month, if my memory serves me. The other mitigation, of course, is where you can apply hypervisor introspection. And hypervisor introspection will look at how do you also serialize and look at the memory space and then obviously address the vulnerabilities prior to them being executed.
Do these fixes break certain types of software?
They do not, no. From also the benefit of using hypervisor introspection, for example, is to ensure that the fix doesn't impact performance significantly. Because obviously, as you remember, back when Spectre and Meltdown patches were issued, a lot of people were hit from a performance perspective.
It didn't break things; it just slowed things down.
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. That's awesome. So how do people apply these patches?
The patches were actually issued by Microsoft last month as one of their Patch Tuesdays. That's the only patch that is available. Obviously, how you roll them out is via the Windows Update mechanism. Now, the big catch there is, as everybody knows, that needs to be based on your patch routine and make sure that you're patched and updated. Obviously, you can't patch and maintain everything all the time and be up to the latest and greatest on patches, which is why there's also the other mitigation of hypervisor introspection.
And will these patches likely require a reboot of your systems?
I'm not aware of that. I don't know.
Probably differs in
that's
different Microsoft operating systems, right?
Microsoft,
may or may not. Yeah. It's Microsoft, so it probably will, right?
Maybe. I don't know. I haven't looked into that.
Have you seen attackers in the real world using this particular variation of the vulnerability, or is this something you've only seen in the research that was done by BitDefender?
Not yet. This is only something from a research perspective. One thing to keep in mind as well is that this is a highly advanced type of, well, if somebody were to try and perform the attack, I wouldn't expect to see it from a run-of-the-mill piece of malware on that. This would be somebody who wants to use it as a nation state or something, or weaponize it like Spectre or Meltdown was.
Right.
So it's a highly sophisticated type of attack.
Yeah, so the difficulty level of pulling this is high. So,
yes.
Yeah. Have you seen Spectre and Meltdown being used in the wild as well, mostly by those attackers that are more advanced, or?
In sophisticated attacks, yes, we have seen from Spectre and Meltdown perspective. And we expect the same from this swap GS attack as well.
And it allows you to pull information from memory. Does that mean I can pull passwords? Like, can I be specific as to what I can pull out of memory?
You can't decide what you want to pull from memory. You're just capturing chunks. It is random what you're capturing. But based on what we've found, you can capture up to 33% of the actual memory space at a time. So it's a quite significant chunk of memory that you can capture at a time. Now, bearing in mind that that is randomized. So
you have to put the pieces back together.
You have to put all the pieces back together.
I gotcha. Yeah. So even if you were to pull off this attack, it's still a lot more work on the back end to make sense of what you got.
Yes. Yeah. It is.
Awesome. Yeah. Now, have you published a paper?
We have. So if you go to BitDefender/swapGS attack, we have a white paper there as well as mitigation and full Q&A. And we'll be keeping that up to date as well on a regular basis.
Fantastic. Well, Gavin, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time today.